Let's address the role the Bitcoin plays in emerging market first, because I just think that there is a lot of activity happening, and lots of people are talking about Bitcoin as an investment, especially, in fully developed country, the US, UK, Europe. But when it comes down to emerging market like Africa, what is the role the Bitcoin plays there?
But I think it plays a larger role than just on the investment side or money go up. I think it plays four key roles. One is definitely as a hedge against inflation. That paired with USDT flows, we've seen a lot of that in the last 18 months, where I think over 65% of the volumes when it comes to crypto in Africa is actually from Bitcoin and USDT, with the majority being USDT. And separately, we're also looking at it as essentially a store of value for a lot of people, given all the failing national currencies across. Another one is actually as a payment rail, both in terms of local commerce, whether it's circular economies, all the way up to individuals using that for cross-border payment.
Hi and welcome to The Financial Fox, the show where we explore how technology is reshaping finance, unlocking freedom, and helping us to invest smarter. I'm your host, Steffi. I've been in finance for over a decade now and started investing in crypto back in 2017. This podcast is all about real conversation with forward-thinking minds to spark new ideas and give you insights that matter. Today we are looking at Bitcoin not just as an investment, but as a tool for real-world change. So we are focusing on the utility aspect of Bitcoin, and especially in emerging markets like Africa. Our guest is a 26 years old from Nigeria who taught himself to code and became a Bitcoin core contributor and investor. Before we get into the interview, a couple of things. If you are watching our interviews, please take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. You will find all the links in the description. And very important, remember that all the content on the show is for informational purposes only and not intended as financial advice. Any opinions expressed by me or my guests are ours alone, and you should not act solely on the back of them. As always, do your own research, level up your skills, and be accountable for your own decisions. Our show is supported by HIVE Digital Technologies, and more about them later in the show. Abu, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
I really want you to share your journey, how you got into Bitcoin, and also all the work that you are doing in Nigeria and the companies you are working with.
Yeah, sure. So I got into Bitcoin in 2017, really just reading up about how it works, the technology. And then in 2018 was when I started reading up more on the technical side, to teach myself how to code, started working with programming languages, and then in 2019 was when I started contributing to Bitcoin Core, and then 2020 I launched the Recursive Capital, the fund. And then 21 was when I got involved with BTrust, got on board in the board side. Since then, we've been doing a lot of work around training. I've also been doing stuff personally on the investment side. And then last year, I also became the interim CEO of BTrust as well, so doing a lot more work on the leadership side there. But essentially, my work is kind of threefold. So one is on the investment side, two is on the development side, so helping train developers in the continent. And then separately, I work on Bitcoin Core.
Interesting. So maybe let's address the role the Bitcoin plays in emerging market first, because I just think that, there is a lot of activity happening, and lots of people are talking about Bitcoin as an investment, especially, in fully developed country, the US, UK, Europe. But when it comes down to emerging market like Africa, what is the role the Bitcoin plays there?
But I think it plays a larger role than just on the investment side or money go up. I think it plays four key roles. One is definitely as a hedge against inflation. That paired with USDT flows, we've seen a lot of that in the last 18 months, where I think over 65% of the volumes when it comes to crypto in Africa is actually from Bitcoin and USDT, with the majority being USDT. And separately, we're also looking at it as essentially a store of value for a lot of people, given all the failing national currencies across. Another one is actually as a payment rail, both in terms of local commerce, whether it's circular economies, all the way up to individuals using that for cross-border payments. I say those four categories have been the main, I'd say maybe in the last 3-4 years.
I'd like to introduce you to our partner, HIVE Digital Technologies, a publicly listed company building the next generation data center infrastructure with 100% renewable energy. HIVE was the first crypto miner to go public and the first one to have an AI strategy. With over 2,600 Bitcoin on their balance sheet and operations in Canada, Sweden, Iceland, and Paraguay, HIVE is fully committed to transforming communities, rebalancing the energy grid, and delivering value to shareholders with a low dilution and cash-focused approach. If you don't know HIVE, check them out at HIVEdigitaltechnologies.com. So one of the things that we've been talking a lot on this channel is Bitcoin as investment, Bitcoin, more recently as a treasury asset. The many public listed companies, but also nation state are embracing, but we haven't really talked much about Bitcoin as payment, which is really what Bitcoin was meant to be when Satoshi created it. And really hope that maybe you can give us some insight on this utility of Bitcoin from the work that you are doing on the development side and also on the investment side as well. And I think people focus a lot on the challenges of Bitcoin as payment.
There's definitely a variety of issues I see. I think first and foremost, I definitely agree that if Bitcoin remains just a digital pet rock that people can hold on to for higher amounts of value, definitely we've failed in terms of the enterprise or the whole mission behind this. I think some of the challenges we've seen have been around the regulatory clarity or the lack of regulatory clarity, especially here in countries like Nigeria. But actually, over the last few months, we had some regulatory clarity. So Bitcoin, for example, now in Nigeria is regulated as a security. While that's not the most ideal regulation here, given without getting too much into the regulatory bodies here on the ground, it is an attempt from the government side to kind of sweep up all the scams that are going on in the broader crypto ecosystem. Definitely see this as a first step into getting some more sane regulation here on the ground. Separately is definitely on the merchant side. We still don't have a critical mass of merchants that accept Bitcoin, so it's kind of difficult to get, even on the circular economy side, to get that circular part going. I think the last one I'd say is probably on the tooling side. We're still in 2025, and I can tell you still not as convenient for individuals to either hold, send, or receive Bitcoin for a variety of reasons. One being, UX is not really that great because it's kind of split between two. So if you really want great UX, you have to go full custodial. If you want to go non-custodial, typically the tools are a bit hard to use. Although what I would say is, unlike other parts of the world, we have a very strong P2P market. So in terms of having that evergreen liquidity, we definitely have a lot of that. So I say those are the major challenges we're seeing. And in terms of how that's being solved, on the dev side, we've definitely seen an uptake in people using the Breeze SDK, some of the other SDKs that are currently out. We're also seeing entrepreneurs building specifically for this local context, whether it's using Lightning technology to make sure that people essentially have a very seamless means from going from bank accounts and back to Lightning and vice versa. Because again, we have instant payments through bank accounts too. So the flow is pretty straightforward for a lot of people. So getting a lot of that, getting some more merchant adoption, getting regulatory clarity, I see is probably the next step for us.
When it comes to payments, one of the aspects that is really important is privacy as well. Yep. And Bitcoin being an open source, fully transparent technology, there is kind of an issue or how Bitcoin can overcome this challenge, this design challenge.
I think it has to do really with development on the ground, taking the shape of making sure folks have adequate privacy tools from the get-go. The same way we don't necessarily have to take a look at seatbelts when we're buying a car. We already expect it to be there. I think the next challenge for developers across the continent is building with that in mind. So specifically saying all the existing technology that we have, both on the protocol level, but also on the UX level, is adhered to on the privacy side. So even if it's a case where there are custodial services, at least letting the users know exactly where the trade-offs are, what are some of the risks that they have to associate with that. Whether it's on the hardware wallet side, making that a lot clearer. So I think it's kind of a mix between building tools that respect privacy at every single level, from how it interacts on the protocol level all the way up to the app development level, but also making sure we pair that with sane education on the ground in terms of just educating the populace around best practices, hygiene when it comes to privacy online and things around that.
Yeah, 100%. I think education remains one of the biggest challenges, especially when it comes as well to regulation as well. What's the situation with the establishment, the regulators in Nigeria?
Yeah, I think initially a few years back, they were a lot more antagonistic to the broader crypto and Bitcoin space. But I think in the last couple of years, they've seen kind of a shift in two ways. So one is in 2022-ish, we had a quasi-ban on the Bitcoin side where exchanges couldn't necessarily tie crypto transactions to bank accounts. So on and off ramping just went fully P2P for like 2 years until they reversed the ban. And in between that time, they realized that having the space essentially hammered down with this, I guess, regulation wasn't necessarily helpful. It's kind of counterintuitive. They tried to ban it, and that essentially made Bitcoin more resilient here on the ground. And it actually made a lot more people kind of trust Bitcoin to a certain extent, because their thinking was, if this is a hedge against, maybe crises around monetary side on the ground, it may be something worth looking at. And a couple other events happened in between that kind of justified some of the trust people had in Bitcoin. But more so, I'd say Bitcoin mining has also played an important role in shifting the government's perspective, especially across other African countries too, because no longer is it a case where we're saying Bitcoin is useful for XYZ reasons. Started seeing that this could be used for real electrification, which has been a huge pain point, especially in countries like Nigeria. But I say in the last maybe 18 months, it's gone from, we have to curb a lot of these issues with regards to Bitcoin affecting the national currency as it being, traded with USDT, etc., all the way up to thinking more holistically around how they could enable this innovation while still protecting the economic side or the downturn here on the continent.
Tell me more about the Bitcoin mining situation in the country.
Yeah, it's definitely getting to the stage where we'll likely see a lot more hash rate uptake in Nigeria specifically, both from the flared mining side as well as the hydro side. Right now, the majority of Bitcoin mining in Africa is actually in the east, so Eastern Africa, specifically Ethiopia, Kenya, etc. The majority of that is through, I should say exclusively, through hydro, as well as some biomass, I believe, through companies like Gridless and the rest. I think Nigeria has taken a bit of a longer term step back in terms of not necessarily being as engaged as the eastern part. And for context, in the last 20 months, we went from, I believe, 1 point something percent global hash rate in Africa to around 3.2. I believe that was like Q4 2024. And the majority of that is actually in Ethiopia. I believe over 2% of that hash rate is in Ethiopia. So we're likely going to see a shift from the 3 all the way up to 5, with the majority of that coming from Nigeria, most likely.
And they're all independent miners who are operating those Bitcoin mining?
Yeah, it's a mix between large-scale miners from outside of the continent, mostly in places like China, or from places like China, I should say, all the way up to individuals that have been ramping up their operations from, below 1 megawatt all the way up to 4 or 5 now.
Interesting. Okay, so, and you have a lot of renewable energy as well. So is that iron the main?
Yeah, HIVE is definitely the main one for a variety of practical reasons without getting too much into technicals. But at the same time, we're also seeing people exploring the flared gas side, mostly because in countries like Nigeria, we're like top 5 gas flares around the world. So it's just pairing that stranded energy that would have been wasted otherwise.
There is definitely a lot of oil and gas in the country, so that would be a great way to kind of like maximize the waste. Now, you mentioned about USDT as well. Why somebody in Nigeria would prefer Bitcoin to USDT?
Yeah, I say it's mostly due to some of the other practical considerations around decentralization, around having higher levels of sovereignty, because again, USDT is still pretty much way more centralized compared to Bitcoin. What I would say is folks aren't necessarily pegging or pitting Bitcoin against USDT. A lot of the times people are actually using them in combination for 2 separate reasons. One is on the dollar side. A lot of countries, especially Nigeria, have really tight control when it comes to US dollar access, physically, but also in terms of the digital form. So a lot of them see USDT as a very convenient avenue for them to be banked on the dollar side or to be dollarized. And then separately on the Bitcoin side, a lot of them see that as kind of an avenue for global commerce and instant payments too. So bridging between the two, a lot of folks have long-term savings within Bitcoin, but also have short-term essentially with USDT, and kind of a mix between the two.
I was going to say exactly that. Maybe for the savings, they would prefer Bitcoin, and then for, more like the day-to-day accounts, they will have USDT. What's the situation with banks? Do they accept crypto? Because here in the UK, it's still kind of challenging, especially if you have a company that does specifically crypto-related business or has got crypto in the name. The banks, especially, like the well-established bank, they will be, but even banks like Revolut, they don't make it so easy to open an account, really.
Yeah, certainly. I think we're in a similar boat. So back when we had the quasi-ban, if you essentially put in crypto or Bitcoin in the narration, receiving bank account gets shut down. Now, since the reversal to date, we haven't necessarily seen a large scale of reporting around that. Although from the last couple of months, we have heard folks saying that accounts are still being shut down. I really verify that without necessarily facing myself. What I can say is we'll likely see a lot more tight coupling between banks as well as crypto operations, given the fact that Bitcoin is not regulated as a securities. Officially, it is legal to interact with Bitcoin on the bank side. I think really the challenge for us is, again, getting clarity regulation away from the security side to make sure that Bitcoin is more regulated in an apt manner, given the fact that it doesn't necessarily meet the standards for securities. But at the same time, I think on the banking side, it'll likely be a case of 2 things. One is trying to still remain compliant with some of the laws on the books, but also seeing what could how they could expose themselves to these new flows, like, crypto transactions, etc. So definitely going to take probably like a year or two before we get more clarity on how that would look like.
And when it comes down to Bitcoin as payment, obviously we have got the Lightning Network that is doing some interesting work for Bitcoin. But because obviously you are a core developer, so you will have some better insight than just general information. How can we get Bitcoin to become money that people exchange?
Yes, there are a variety of ways, I think. And it's not necessarily on the shoulders of education. I think we've kind of seen that education without necessarily having practical tools on the ground doesn't necessarily scale as much because people, they will understand exactly what we're talking about Bitcoin, but without necessarily an avenue for them to actually explore this technology and see it firsthand how it actually works, it really doesn't make too much sense. So I think it's really around making sure that we're building tools that already plug into existing infrastructure that make it really, really convenient and very easy for them to interact with Bitcoin. So we're talking about leveraging the Lightning Network. We're talking about using, Lightning addresses because they're super convenient. We're talking about easily going from bank accounts, deposits, on-ramping and off-ramping, but also making sure that they have, like I said, clean hygiene when it comes to the privacy side. So ensuring these tools are not just convenient, but they're also protecting users' interests as well as privacy, etc. I think that's kind of how we get to that next step. And then naturally, we'll have a lot of people essentially looking at this more from a concrete perspective of what can I actually use these tools for, as opposed to what are these tools to begin with.
Which is the main exchange that people...
I see the majority of it is still P2P. It kind of shifts between previously, a few years back, it was Binance that was kind of dominant, but right now we've seen in terms of centralized exchanges, we've seen anything between, Bybit to No Ones and a bunch of others. I think really for a lot of people, it's a lot more avenues for them to accept crypto or kind of on-ramp and off-ramp. So whether we're looking at companies like BitNob all the way up to, again, like I said, Bybit and some of the others that are more centralized, all the way up to really even just full-on P2P, like sending you Bitcoin and I receive a bank wire on the other side.
And when it comes down to, obviously you said that you do lots of training. I'm just interested, do you do training to very young people or maybe to more older people, to, professionals, they are not educated yet? Where do you see what is really the group that, first of all, you are focusing on and the one that really need to know?
Definitely, I say the young folks, and it's for one single practical reason. Over 60% of the population here in a country like Nigeria is between the ages of 18 to 25, and across Africa is closer to 66% across other countries. The de facto demographic, the majority of folks on the continent are already young. That's really the target demographic for a lot of the trading that we do, especially on the dev side. In terms of the more senior folks, what we've mostly seen is kind of education that is more broad outside of developer education. That spans all the way up from some of our portfolio companies like BitNob doing some more workshops, all the way up to folks locally engaging with that demographic. And it's mostly on a practical level, so they're not necessarily being taught how to build companies or kind of work with that. Yeah. It's more a case of using these tools practically and conveniently, whether it's self-custody or just using hardware wallets and kind of the benefit of that.
How they do on and off ramp, how do they invest Bitcoin, how should they custody, should they learn about self-custody as well, because It's obviously not for everyone. So it's a kind of like all the tools to build your Bitcoin strategy. There has been a lot obviously recently about Bitcoin as a treasury assets and that kind of strategy that started obviously with strategy. I was at the Orlando event last month, or earlier this month, but was how Nigeria is thinking about these Bitcoin as treasury assets, first of all on a nation state level, and then when it comes down to corporation.
I see on the nation state level, we're not definitely there yet in terms of considering this as whether as a strategic Bitcoin reserve or even as holding Bitcoin as a means of debt services down the line. I think that would come with time. Again, mostly due to some of the benefits we see from Bitcoin mining, making a lot clearer as a convincing argument for the government to get more strategically involved with that, even on the geopolitical side. Now, separately on the company side, we're seeing way more headways. I think the last few conversations I had with a bunch of other folks, not necessarily naming names, we have a situation where there are a lot of fintechs here on the ground who have essentially liquidity that's just stuck in US dollars in bank accounts, which for them, they need a mechanism to kind of de-risk that, because by virtue of them being, Nigerian founders, a lot of the time we've seen some of these banking rails in the US essentially rug pull them just because of the compliance requirements for just maintaining them on their books. So for a lot of them, they're looking at other avenues to actually store this excess capital that they have. And for the plain fact that Bitcoin is very, very good hedge against inflation and store of value. A lot of them are starting to strategically think about how they could move some of those flows from dormant bank accounts in the US to having that in Bitcoin in the form of Bitcoin Treasuries. I think in terms of uptake and how what the timeline will be like in terms of that transition between dormant dollars to having Bitcoin long term will likely be within the next, I say, 18, 16 months for a lot of these companies here on the ground.
Interesting. I didn't ask you about the currency devaluation in your...
Oh yeah, it's really bad. I think in the last 3 years, the Naira has been devalued over 70%. And couple that with, I believe, around 23% inflation is the current rate. And other than that, we also had a food crisis previously, I think, that kicked off, I think, 2 years ago. But also at the same time, we also had the crisis on the Naira side in terms of fungibility 2 years ago as well, after the general election here on the ground, where we had the e-Naira, which nobody uses, all the way up to the physical new as well, old notes, because we had the bank transition. I think we're still even in the transition period between those two notes, but also having the Naira in bank account. So we definitely reached a point in Nigeria where we have a lot of economic challenges, but also monetary challenge to just the Naira not necessarily being a cohesive currency to begin with.
When it comes to Africa, which is the country that is really leading in the crypto space?
I'd say it's probably between Nigeria and like a Kenya. And the reason why I bring those two is kind of the contrast between what we're seeing in terms of development of the technology on the ground, or say maybe high levels of adoption. On the Nigerian side, or maybe in the West African side, what we can say is a lot of volumes around exchanges, a lot of use cases around using it as a money, etc. And then more so on the East, we're seeing a lot of work on the Bitcoin mining side. We're also seeing circular economies coming up as well as a result of that. And then I say down south really is where a lot of the circular economy work has been catalyzed as well to Bitcoin and Cash in South Africa. And I see the rest is kind of picking up in between, central as well as north, both in terms of development, but also getting involved with the flows, etc. So I say development is definitely one of the things that I think will pick up and probably be at the forefront in the next 5 years. But in between, we'll likely see increased flows and volumes on the Bitcoin side, but also, like I said, on Treasury side, and also on the mining side. So I say that's kind of how the demographics are around the continent.
Yeah, interesting. There is one aspect that I want to talk to you, because you got in crypto at the same time that I did in 2017. And you are now basically focused on Bitcoin, but you have been looking also outside like I did. We look at Web3, we look at different type of crypto, and obviously it wasn't our fault, because it was kind of like how everything has developed, and there were projects that were getting lots of traction. They were focusing on very interesting use cases. They were getting investment. So you kind of see, oh gosh, crypto is kind of like really becoming the new infrastructure of the future. But then when it comes down to execution and sustainability of those projects, the majority of them found it very hard to basically remain relevant. And I kind of got to I had the same journey. So, starting investing in Bitcoin, and then exploring all different kind of aspect of the crypto ecosystem. And then after, how many years is now, it's a long time. We go back to Bitcoin. And that's something that with your investment, you kind of found, if I understand correctly, you found yourself, exploring all like the very interesting and vibrant crypto ecosystem, and then going back to Bitcoin. So tell me a bit about that, why you go back to Bitcoin, and then I think what I want to know is, where are you investing right now? What is exciting for you?
I definitely start with the end. I think in terms of what excites me is really just pairing Bitcoin with real world use cases. I think we've been slightly, not necessarily distracted as a space, but really down in the weeds in terms of the technical conversations, as well as where, development has gone. And I think a lot of folks are now starting to reel it back in to make sure that we're actually building for people that exist and not theoretical people in terms of how some of these design choices are being made. I think right now, in terms of the investment focus for us at Recursive, what we're really looking at is seeing solutions that actually solve real problems on the ground using Bitcoin technology effectively, and not just, fancy things that look cool. Other than that, I'd say in terms of the strategy that we've had since launch with Recursive, really the idea for us was kind of painting the picture of a broader Web3 space. And at that time, we assumed that would just be Bitcoin as well as other frontier technologies around the protocol side with privacy tools, etc. And then a year into that, we realized that even the framing of Web3 was not helpful. We got a lot of crypto pitches, which was not really what we were looking at. So we decided to just brand it as fully a Bitcoin VC, just to clarify to people that that's what the main focus is. So in terms of Recursive, we tried to define everything within the current lens that we're seeing it, which is Bitcoin and everything else, versus kind of everything else with Bitcoin being a part of that. And I say separately as on a personal level, getting to the space in 2017, I definitely can relate to the fact that I was a lot more open to everything else just because everything was so new to me. But I think what ended up happening over the last few years has been, or maybe I say the last half decade or plus, has been a realization that there's been a bucket of essentially promises versus deliveries. Deliveries have all been on the Bitcoin side. I think the one thing that's come out of crypto that you could say has some utility is USDT. Other than that, a lot of it has just been a single thing, which is kind of just playing on two things. One is a lot of the FOMO that people feel getting into Bitcoin, what they essentially promise others is that Bitcoin is way too expensive right now. Instead of just going into that, you can wait for this to get to the point where it's like Bitcoin. And obviously for technical and practical reasons, that's never going to be the case. And then separately, another claim that they've had that's kind of on the heartstrings of a lot of people has been because they claim Bitcoin is super slow on chain, which is not even the case compared to some of these projects. The way in which they do marketing is around sacrificing all the things that make Bitcoin useful, like decentralization, etc., and then having it essentially on a centralized database with a lot of technical jargon and white papers. And then because obviously if you centralize a lot of these flows, they're going to be way faster than on-chain. They kind of paint that as this is like Bitcoin 3.0. So we've seen a lot of those two things being used in conjunction to kind of convince people that this is worthwhile. What I've noticed over the last couple of years, even training developers, getting them jobs in, Gala, which is now BTrust Builders, all the way up to focusing now exclusively through BTrust on the FOSS side, is a lot of people have definitely grown up to kind of see what all this, I guess, the facade is on their end. Basically seeing that a lot of this is really just promises and nothing has really materialized.
Yeah.
And in terms of sustainability long term, a lot of them in terms of employment, but also having a long term focus to work on, I've really seen that you can only find that in Bitcoin. Everything else is either a temporary trend or some sort of short-term thinking. So a lot of the folks that went the crypto route are still looking for jobs month in, month out. A lot of folks that settled in Bitcoin are looking at their second focus all the way up to like their job that have been stable in like 5 years. So that's kind of where we see the difference between the two.
A lot of investors, they invested out of Bitcoin, they lost their money. And if they would have just stayed in Bitcoin, that was going to be the best. Now,
Exactly.
it's very interesting what you're saying. It's kind of like one of the things that people tried to do was to change Bitcoin or do some makeup to make it look like the current financial, system, or, more similar to other blockchain like Ethereum also, or, similar to that. Actually, they should have focused on the key core aspect of Bitcoin
Yeah.
because that is a new way to think about finance and to think about money. And when you say about we focus on real use cases of Bitcoin, can you maybe expand a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, certainly. I think the challenge previously has been trying to use the most bleeding edge technology and framing that as something novel that's happening on the ground. Whereas a lot of the times you saw people either on the ground or not necessarily taking a large keen interest in the fact that this is bleeding edge technology. And really all they care about is something that works conveniently. So we saw in things like, companies like Meriton Kura that started allowing for Bitcoin to be sent offline, which is a novel use case in and of itself, but not necessarily focusing on using the most bleeding edge technology that's available. Really a case of matching a standard that already existed on the Lightning Network and then pairing that with something that isn't necessarily available outside of Africa, which is the USSD Coast Protocol itself. So we're seeing things around that. And I'd say maybe the last year or so, we've seen people using a similar technology, still the same Lightning addresses, pairing that with bank account invoices and having that as a convenient means to deposit Naira, have that in Bitcoin, and then off-ramp vice versa. So in terms of the practical use cases, what I really mean in essence is ensuring that all the existing rails, whether it's bank accounts or mobile money, USSD codes, etc., are still being used as the primary mechanism for interacting with the legacy financial system, but also comparing that or putting that in in conjunction with some more tools that are not necessarily too far-fetched in terms of how they actually have practical use cases, but something that's usable, and then packaging that in a very useful and a very straightforward UX flow for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely there is a lot of work that still has to be done in order to bring the revolution of Bitcoin into today's world, and
Exactly.
I think that's really interesting. Abu, thank you so much for coming on the show. Is there any particular project that you are investing that you're particularly excited about or you want to mention on the show?
Well, we have a few that are going to be announced in the next couple of months, but Essentially, all of them are still focused on just one aspect, like we mentioned, making sure Bitcoin is practical for people on the ground to get to that next phase of adoption and use case.
Yeah, love that. Making sure the Bitcoin is practical to get to the next stage of adoption, because that's exactly what we need. Abu, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to meet you, and yeah, I think you are doing something really important for the community. Yeah, especially in emerging market, because Bitcoin is not just for rich people that have got money to invest. Bitcoin, it was born as more egalitarian type of money, so it's important that we also talk about that.
100%. It's definitely the people's money. And that's just what we need to focus on.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.